Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into one of history's most misunderstood professions, the medieval assassin. While Hollywood paints them as shadowy masters of death, elegant killers who vanished into the night with pockets full of gold, the reality was far grimmer. Being a medieval assassin wasn't just dangerous, it was quite possibly the worst job in human history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to explore a world where death was currency, trust was a luxury no one could afford, and survival meant becoming something less than human. When most people think of medieval assassins, they picture figures from video games and movies, hooded warriors leaping from rooftops, hidden blades gleaming in moonlight, secret brotherhoods operating from mountain fortresses. The reality was far more desperate and infinitely more tragic. Let's start with who actually became assassins in medieval times. These weren't elite warriors trained from childhood in mystical arts. They weren't chosen ones blessed with supernatural abilities. They were society's discards, desperate men and occasionally women who had run out of every other option. Picture this. You're a peasant whose crops have failed for the third year running. Your family is starving. The local lord has increased taxes again, and you can't pay. You've already sold everything you own, including your tools. Winter is coming, and you have no food, no shelter, and no hope. A stranger approaches you in a tavern, slides a small purse across the table, and whispers a name. That's how most assassins were born, not through mystical calling, but through crushing desperation. The typical medieval assassin was a failed farmer, a disgraced soldier, an ex-thief who'd lost his nerve, or a craftsman whose guild had expelled him. They were people who had already died socially and economically, making them perfect for a profession that required you to be invisible, expendable, and morally flexible. Consider the case of Guillaume de Nogaret's agents in early 14th century France. These weren't mysterious figures in flowing robes. They were unemployed mercenaries, bankrupt merchants, and criminals fleeing justice. They lived in squalor, died young, and were forgotten immediately. No songs were sung about them. No legends grew around their deeds. They simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. The training, if you could call it that, was brutal and basic. There were no ancient masters teaching secret techniques. You learned by doing, and if you survived your first few jobs, you might pick up some useful skills along the way. Most didn't survive. The mortality rate for new assassins was staggering. Some estimates suggest that fewer than 1 in 10 survived their first year in the profession. What skills did they actually need? First and foremost, the ability to blend in completely. An assassin had to become invisible in plain sight, to be so unremarkable that witnesses would struggle to describe them even minutes after seeing them. This meant mastering the art of being forgettable, wearing common clothes, adopting local accents, learning to walk and gesture like the people around them. They needed to be excellent liars, capable of maintaining false identities for weeks or months at a time. They had to memorize cover stories so thoroughly that they could recite them under torture. They needed to understand local customs, religious practices, and social hierarchies well enough to navigate them without arousing suspicion. Physical skills were important, but not in the way popular culture suggests. They didn't need to be master swordsmen. In fact, being too skilled with weapons could be a liability, as it would mark them as professional fighters. Instead, they needed to be competent with simple, concealable weapons: daggers, garrots, small crossbows, and poisons. Speaking of poisons, this was perhaps the most crucial skill for a medieval assassin. Poison was the great equalizer. It allowed a weak person to kill a strong one, enabled a single assassin to eliminate multiple targets, and provided a degree of separation between the killer and the victim. But medieval poisons were unreliable, difficult to obtain, and dangerous to handle. Many assassins poisoned themselves accidentally while preparing their weapons. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike soldiers who killed in the heat of battle surrounded by comrades, assassins killed in cold blood, alone, often targeting people who had never wronged them personally. They had to live with the knowledge that they were murderers, that their very existence was a crime against God and man. Many turned to drink or drugs to cope with the guilt and fear. Others simply went mad. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. An assassin couldn't have friends, couldn't trust anyone, couldn't even trust themselves. They lived in constant fear of betrayal, knowing that their employers would kill them without hesitation if it became convenient. They couldn't form lasting relationships because intimacy meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. The myth of the honorable assassin, the killer with a code, was largely a later invention. Medieval assassins were desperate people doing desperate things for desperate reasons. They weren't heroes or anti-heroes. They were victims of a system that offered them no other choice but starvation or damnation. Let's talk about money, because despite what the movies tell you, being a medieval assassin was not a path to riches. In fact, it was quite possibly one of the worst-paying jobs in the medieval world when you factored in the risks, expenses, and short career span. The payment structure for assassins was deliberately exploitative. Employers, usually nobles, merchants, or church officials, held all the power in these transactions. They could afford to pay poorly because they knew assassins had no other options and no recourse if they were cheated. A typical assassination contract might pay anywhere from a few silver coins to a small bag of gold, depending on the target's importance and the difficulty of the job. This sounds reasonable until you consider the expenses involved. An assassin had to purchase weapons, poisons, disguises, bribes, safe passage, food, and lodging. They often had to travel long distances, sometimes across multiple kingdoms, all while maintaining their cover identity. Let's break down the economics of a hypothetical assassination in 13th century England. Say you're hired to kill a minor lord who's been causing problems for a more powerful noble. The contract pays 20 silver marks, a substantial sum for a peasant. But remember, you're not a peasant anymore. You're a professional killer, and your expenses reflect that reality. First, you need information. Who is this lord? Where does he live? What are his habits, his weaknesses, his security arrangements? This intelligence doesn't come free. You'll need to bribe servants, buy drinks for guards, pay informants. That's easily 3 to 4 silver marks right there. Next, you need equipment. A good dagger costs money. Poison is expensive and dangerous to obtain. You'll need clothes appropriate to your cover identity. If you're posing as a merchant, you need merchant's clothes, which aren't cheap. You might need a horse, or at least passage on a merchant's wagon. Another 5 to 6 silver marks. Then, there's the job itself. You might need to spend weeks or months establishing your cover, living in the target's vicinity, building relationships, waiting for the right opportunity. During this time, you're paying for food, lodging, and maintaining your false identity. You can't work other jobs because you're busy being an assassin. That's another 8 to 10 silver marks minimum. So out of your 20 silver mark fee, you've already spent 16 to 20 marks on expenses. If everything goes perfectly, you might break even. But things rarely go perfectly in the assassination business. What if your target is more heavily guarded than expected? You might need to bribe additional people, purchase better equipment, or wait longer for an opportunity. What if you're injured during the attempt? Medical care costs money, and you can't exactly go to the local physician and explain that you were hurt while committing murder. What if you're caught? The standard punishment for assassination was death, but sometimes you could buy your way out with a large enough bribe. That could cost everything you've earned and more. What if your employer decides you know too much and needs to be eliminated? You might have to flee the kingdom entirely, abandoning everything you own. The payment structure was also designed to minimize the employer's risk. Typically, an assassin would receive a small advance, just enough to cover initial expenses, with the remainder paid upon completion of the job. This meant that if the assassin was caught or killed before completing the contract, the employer lost very little money. But here's the real kicker. Employers frequently refused to pay the full amount even when the job was completed successfully. What was an assassin going to do? Take them to court? File a complaint with the local authorities? The employer held all the cards, and they knew it. Some assassins tried to protect themselves by demanding payment in advance, but this rarely worked. Employers knew that an assassin who had already been paid might simply disappear with the money rather than risk their life completing the job. Trust was a rare commodity in the assassination business, and it flowed in only one direction. The most successful assassins were those who managed to build long-term relationships with powerful patrons. These arrangements offered more steady work and better pay, but they came with their own risks. The more jobs you did for the same employer, the more you knew about their business, and the more dangerous you became to them. Many assassins found themselves eliminated by their own patrons once they had outlived their usefulness. There were also the hidden costs that no one talks about. The psychological toll of constantly living in fear, the physical wear and tear of a dangerous lifestyle, the social isolation that came with being a professional killer. These costs couldn't be measured in silver, but they were real nonetheless. The average career span of a medieval assassin was shockingly short. Most lasted less than 2 years before they were killed, captured, or forced to flee. During that brief career, they might complete a dozen jobs if they were lucky and skilled. Even if each job paid well, which was rare, it wasn't enough to set them up for life. Some assassins tried to supplement their income with other criminal activities: theft, smuggling, extortion. But these activities brought additional risks and often conflicted with their primary profession. A thief who was caught might face imprisonment or mutilation. An assassin who was caught faced death. The economics of assassination were deliberately structured to keep assassins desperate and dependent. Employers wanted killers who were hungry enough to take risks, but not wealthy enough to become independent. They wanted people who could be discarded without consequence, who had no family or friends to avenge them, who would disappear without a trace when their usefulness ended. In the end, most medieval assassins died poor, alone, and forgotten. The few who managed to accumulate any wealth usually lost it quickly, to medical expenses, bribes, or simply the high cost of staying alive in a profession where everyone wanted you dead. The idea of the wealthy, successful assassin living in luxury was pure fantasy. The reality was grinding poverty punctuated by brief moments of terror and violence. Forget everything you've seen in movies about assassins and their equipment. There were no retractable hidden blades, no exotic weapons forged by master craftsmen, no gadgets that would make James Bond jealous. Medieval assassins worked with crude, simple tools that were more likely to get them killed than help them succeed. The primary weapon of choice was the dagger, not because it was elegant or sophisticated, but because it was cheap, concealable, and didn't require years of training to use effectively. A good dagger could be purchased for a few copper coins or stolen from a dead soldier. It was small enough to hide under clothing, sharp enough to kill quickly if you knew where to strike, and common enough that carrying one wouldn't arouse suspicion. But even something as simple as a dagger came with problems. Medieval metallurgy was inconsistent at best. A blade might look sharp and sturdy but snap at the crucial moment. The metal could be too soft, bending instead of cutting, or too hard, shattering on impact with bone. Many assassins carried multiple daggers because they couldn't trust any single weapon to work when needed. The quality of the blade often reflected the assassin's economic status. Wealthy assassins, and there were very few of those, might own a well-made dagger with a sharp, durable edge and a comfortable grip. Poor assassins, which was most of them, made do with crude knives that were little better than sharpened pieces of scrap metal. These weapons were as dangerous to the user as to the target. Poison was the assassin's other primary tool, and it was even less reliable than steel. Medieval poisons were derived from plants, minerals, and animal parts, and their potency varied wildly depending on the source, preparation, and storage. What worked as a lethal dose for one person might only make another person sick. What killed quickly in summer might take days to work in winter. The most common poisons were plant-based: hemlock, nightshade, foxglove, and various mushrooms. These had to be gathered at the right time of year, prepared correctly, and stored properly to maintain their potency. An assassin needed extensive knowledge of botany, chemistry, and medicine, knowledge that was difficult to acquire and dangerous to practice. Hemlock, for example, was relatively easy to find and prepare, but its effects were unpredictable. A small dose might cause nothing more than stomach upset. A large dose could kill within hours, but it could also cause violent convulsions that would alert everyone within earshot that something was wrong. The victim might have time to identify their attacker before dying. Nightshade was more reliable, but harder to obtain and prepare. It grew in specific conditions and had to be harvested at the right time. The preparation process was complex and dangerous. Many assassins poisoned themselves while trying to extract the active compounds. Even when properly prepared, Nightshade could take hours or days to kill, giving the victim time to seek help or identify their attacker. Mineral poisons like arsenic and mercury were more reliable but much more expensive and difficult to obtain. They were typically controlled by physicians, alchemists, and wealthy merchants who had no interest in selling them to obvious criminals. An assassin might spend months trying to acquire a small amount of arsenic, only to discover that it had been diluted or contaminated. The delivery method was another challenge. Poison had to be administered without the victim's knowledge, which meant it had to be tasteless, odorless, and colorless when mixed with food or drink. Most medieval poisons failed on at least one of these criteria. Hemlock had a distinctive bitter taste. Nightshade could cause a burning sensation in the mouth. Arsenic, while relatively tasteless, often caused immediate nausea that would make the victim suspicious. Assassins tried various methods to mask the taste and effects of poison. They mixed it with strong-tasting foods like wine or spiced meat. They used small doses over time to build up a lethal concentration without causing immediate symptoms. They combined different poisons to create more complex effects. But all of these methods required extensive knowledge, careful planning, and a great deal of luck. The timing was crucial. Poison had to be administered when the assassin could escape before the effects became apparent. This meant understanding not just the poison's potency but its onset time, duration, and symptoms. A poison that worked too quickly might trap the assassin at the scene. One that worked too slowly might give the victim time to identify the source. Beyond daggers and poison, assassins used whatever tools they could find or afford. Garrots made from wire or rope were cheap and effective but required getting very close to the target. Small crossbows were accurate and quiet but expensive and difficult to conceal. Clubs and hammers could kill with a single blow, but were crude and messy. Some assassins used more creative weapons. A sharpened hairpin could puncture an artery if inserted in the right place. A heavy ring could crush a windpipe with a well-placed blow. Even common items like eating utensils or writing implements could be turned into weapons with enough skill and desperation. The problem with improvised weapons was that they required extensive knowledge of human anatomy and considerable skill to use effectively. Most assassins lacked this knowledge and skill. They learned through trial and error, which meant their early attempts were often failures that left them exposed and their targets alive and angry. Armor was generally not an option for assassins. It was expensive, heavy, and conspicuous. An assassin needed to blend in, to appear harmless and unremarkable. A person wearing armor was obviously a warrior, which would defeat the purpose of stealth and surprise. Instead, assassins relied on speed, surprise, and the hope that they could strike before their target could react. The maintenance of weapons and tools was another constant challenge. Daggers needed to be kept sharp, which required whetstones and skill. Poisons degraded over time and had to be replaced regularly. Garrots could fray or break. Everything had to be concealed, which meant weapons couldn't be properly maintained or stored. An assassin might carry their dagger wrapped in cloth inside their boot, where it would be hidden but also exposed to moisture, dirt, and constant pressure. The blade would dull quickly, the handle might crack, and rust could set in within days. But there was no choice. Visibility meant death, so weapons had to be hidden regardless of the consequences. The procurement of weapons was its own challenge. An assassin couldn't simply walk into a blacksmith shop and order a murder weapon. They had to be subtle, purchasing items that could serve dual purposes or stealing what they needed. A kitchen knife could work as a weapon. A rope could serve as a garrote. A small hammer could crush a skull. But this approach meant that assassins were often working with suboptimal tools. A kitchen knife wasn't designed for combat. It might be too dull, too fragile, or the wrong shape for effective killing. A rope might be too thick to work as a garrote or too thin to provide a good grip. A hammer might be too heavy to conceal or too light to kill with a single blow. The psychological aspect of weapons cannot be overlooked. Killing someone with a dagger required getting close enough to smell their breath, to see the fear in their eyes, to feel their blood on your hands. It was intimate and horrifying in a way that modern weapons are not. Many assassins found that they couldn't go through with the act when the moment came, despite all their preparation and desperation. This psychological barrier led some assassins to prefer poison, which allowed them to maintain distance from the actual moment of death. But poison brought its own psychological challenges. The assassin had to watch their victim suffer, sometimes for hours or days, knowing that they were responsible for that agony. The guilt could be overwhelming. The unreliability of medieval weapons meant that assassins often had to improvise in the moment. A dagger might break, forcing them to use their hands. Poison might not work, requiring a more direct approach. A garrote might slip, leaving the victim alive and screaming. The ability to adapt quickly was often the difference between success and death. Many assassins carried multiple weapons as backup, but this created its own problems. More weapons meant more weight, more bulk, more chances of being discovered. Each additional tool increased the risk of detection while providing only marginal improvement in effectiveness. The crude nature of medieval weapons also meant that assassination attempts were often messy and obvious. A dagger wound was clearly the result of violence. Poison might cause symptoms that pointed to foul play. Unlike modern methods that could make a death appear natural, medieval assassination was usually recognizable as murder. This visibility created additional problems for the assassin. Once a death was identified as murder, investigations would begin. Witnesses would be questioned, strangers would be scrutinized, and the net would begin to close. The assassin had to escape not just the immediate scene, but the entire region before the investigation could identify them. The tools of the medieval assassin were, in summary, crude, unreliable, and dangerous to use. They reflected the desperate circumstances of the people who wielded them, individuals with no resources, no training, and no support, trying to accomplish an impossible task with inadequate equipment. The wonder is not that so many assassination attempts failed, but that any succeeded at all. The human mind is not designed for murder. Despite what popular culture suggests, killing another person, especially in cold blood, goes against our deepest psychological programming. For medieval assassins, this created a mental battlefield that was often more dangerous than any physical threat they faced. Consider what it means to take a life deliberately, not in the heat of battle where adrenaline and survival instinct can override moral considerations, but in cold calculation. To plan someone's death, to study their habits, to get close enough to see them as a human being with hopes and fears and loved ones, and then to kill them anyway. This requires a fundamental rewiring of the human psyche. Most people who became assassins were not natural killers. They were desperate individuals driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological transformation required to become an effective assassin was traumatic and often incomplete. Many never fully adapted to their new role, carrying the weight of their actions like a physical burden that grew heavier with each job. The first kill was always the hardest. Accounts from confessions and trial records describe assassins who spent hours or even days working up the courage to strike. They would approach their target, weapon in hand, only to lose their nerve at the crucial moment. Some made multiple attempts before finally succeeding. Others never managed it at all, fleeing in terror or breaking down completely. Those who did succeed in their first kill often described it as a moment of profound disconnection from themselves. They felt as if they were watching someone else commit the act, as if their body was moving without their conscious control. This dissociation was a psychological defense mechanism, but it came with its own costs. The immediate aftermath of a first kill was typically devastating. Guilt, horror, and self-loathing crashed over the assassin like a wave. Many vomited uncontrollably. Some collapsed and had to be carried away from the scene. Others stood frozen, staring at what they had done, unable to process the reality of it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how quickly some adapted. The human mind has a remarkable ability to normalize even the most extreme experiences. What seemed impossible and horrifying the first time became routine with repetition. The psychological barriers that protected most people from becoming killers could be worn down through necessity and practice. This adaptation came at a terrible cost. To function as an assassin, a person had to suppress their natural empathy, their moral instincts, their capacity for human connection. They had to become, in essence, less human. The psychological techniques they used to cope with their profession, emotional numbing, dehumanization of targets, compartmentalization of guilt, were the same mechanisms that created sociopaths and psychopaths. Many assassins turned to alcohol or drugs to manage their psychological pain. Wine, ale, and various herbal concoctions could dull the guilt and fear, at least temporarily, but substance abuse brought its own problems. An intoxicated assassin was a sloppy assassin, more likely to make mistakes that would get them caught or killed. The very coping mechanisms they relied on undermined their ability to do their job effectively. Sleep became another battleground. Nightmares were common, featuring the faces of victims, scenes of violence, and imagined punishments. Many assassins suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and an inability to form normal relationships. The isolation inherent in the profession made these psychological problems worse. An assassin couldn't seek comfort from friends or family, couldn't confess their sins to a priest without risking exposure, couldn't find solace in normal human connections. They were alone with their guilt and trauma, forced to carry burdens that would have broken most people. Some assassins developed elaborate justifications for their actions. They told themselves they were serving a greater good, eliminating evil people who deserved to die. They convinced themselves that their targets were enemies of God or threats to innocent people. These rationalizations helped them function, but they were built on foundations of self-deception that could crumble at any moment. Others embraced their role as monsters, taking pride in their ability to kill without remorse. This psychological adaptation was perhaps even more disturbing than guilt-ridden suffering. These individuals had successfully suppressed their humanity to the point where they could commit murder without emotional consequence. They had become the very thing that most people feared in the dark. The relationship between assassin and target was psychologically complex. In order to get close enough to kill someone, an assassin often had to study them extensively, learning their habits, their preferences, their vulnerabilities. This intimate knowledge created a twisted form of connection. The assassin might know their target better than the target's own family did. Some assassins reported feeling a strange affection for their targets, even as they planned to kill them. They might admire the person's courage, intelligence, or kindness, while simultaneously preparing to end their life. This cognitive dissonance created additional psychological stress and made the act of killing even more traumatic. The moment of the kill itself was often described in terms of profound disconnection. Time seemed to slow down or speed up. Sounds became muffled or unnaturally loud. The assassin might feel as if they were floating outside their body, watching the scene unfold from a distance. These dissociative experiences were the mind's way of protecting itself from the full impact of what was happening. But the protection was temporary. Eventually, the reality would crash back in, often with devastating force. The assassin would be left to deal with the full weight of what they had done, with no support system and no legitimate way to process their trauma. The fear of retribution added another layer of psychological stress. An assassin lived with the constant knowledge that they were hunted, that discovery meant death, that every stranger might be an enemy. This hypervigilance was exhausting and made normal life impossible. They couldn't relax, couldn't trust, couldn't form meaningful relationships. Many assassins developed paranoid tendencies, seeing threats everywhere, suspecting everyone of plotting against them. This paranoia was often justified. They really were in constant danger, but it made their lives even more isolated and miserable. The religious implications of their profession created additional psychological burdens. Medieval society was deeply religious, and murder was considered one of the gravest sins. An assassin faced not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. The fear of hell was real and immediate, adding spiritual terror to their already overwhelming psychological burdens. Some assassins tried to find religious justification for their actions, convincing themselves that they were instruments of divine justice. Others abandoned faith entirely, deciding that if they were damned anyway, they might as well embrace their fate. Both responses were forms of psychological self-protection, but neither provided real peace. The cumulative effect of these psychological pressures was devastating. Most assassins didn't last long in the profession, not because they were killed or captured, but because they simply couldn't handle the mental strain. They broke down, fled, or found other ways to escape their circumstances. Those who did survive psychologically were often fundamentally changed. They became hollow shells of their former selves, capable of functioning, but incapable of truly living. They had traded their humanity for survival, and the bargain left them with nothing worth preserving. The psychology of the medieval assassin reveals the true cost of this profession. It wasn't just dangerous or poorly paid, it was soul-destroying. It required people to become something monstrous, to sacrifice their essential humanity for the sake of survival. In the end, even the most successful assassins were victims of their circumstances, broken by a world that offered them no better choices. Perhaps no aspect of the assassin's life was more devastating than the complete social isolation that came with the profession. Human beings are social creatures by nature. We need connection, community, and belonging to maintain our psychological health. For medieval assassins, these basic human needs became luxuries they could never afford. The isolation began the moment someone accepted their first contract. From that point forward, they could never again be completely honest with another human being. Every conversation became a performance, every relationship a potential threat. They had to maintain false identities, not just with strangers, but with everyone they encountered, including people they might genuinely care about. Consider the simple act of making friends. For most people, friendship develops through shared experiences, mutual trust, and gradual revelation of personal details. An assassin could never participate in this natural process. They couldn't share their real name, their true background, or their actual profession. They had to construct elaborate lies about their past and maintain those lies consistently, even under casual questioning. The mental energy required to maintain false identities was exhausting. An assassin had to remember not just their cover story, but all the small details that made it believable. What town were they supposedly from? What was their father's profession? Did they have siblings? What were their religious beliefs? Every casual conversation was a minefield of potential exposure. Romantic relationships were even more complicated. Love requires vulnerability, trust, and emotional intimacy, all things that could get an assassin killed. How could they explain their frequent absences, their mysterious income, their reluctance to discuss their past? How could they be intimate with someone while hiding the most fundamental truth about themselves? Some assassins tried to maintain romantic relationships anyway, but these attempts usually ended in tragedy. Either the relationship remained shallow and unsatisfying, based on lies and deception, or the assassin eventually revealed the truth and faced betrayal, blackmail, or abandonment. Many assassins' lovers ended up dead, either killed by the assassin to protect their secret or murdered by enemies who used them as leverage. The inability to form lasting relationships created a vicious cycle of loneliness and desperation. The more isolated an assassin became, the more they craved human connection. But the more they craved connection, the more likely they were to make mistakes that would expose them. Many assassins were caught because they trusted the wrong person or revealed too much in a moment of weakness. Family relationships were particularly painful. An assassin who had family members faced an impossible choice: maintain contact and put their loved ones at risk, or disappear completely and live with the knowledge that their family believed them dead or abandoned. Most chose the latter option, but the psychological cost was enormous. Imagine never being able to see your children grow up, never being able to comfort your parents in their old age, never being able to celebrate holidays or share important moments with the people you loved most. This sacrifice was often harder to bear than the physical dangers of the profession. Some assassins tried to maintain family connections through intermediaries or secret meetings, but this was incredibly dangerous. Family members could be tortured for information, used as bait, or killed as punishment for the assassin's crimes. The safest course was complete separation, but safety came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. The professional isolation was equally devastating. Unlike other dangerous professions, soldiers, for example, assassins couldn't bond with colleagues or share their experiences with people who understood their struggles. Each assassin worked alone, competed with others for contracts, and viewed every other assassin as a potential threat. There were no guilds for assassins, no professional organizations, no support networks. If an assassin was injured, they had to heal alone. If they needed advice, they had to figure things out themselves. If they wanted to retire, they had to plan their exit without help or guidance. The profession offered no community, no mentorship, no sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The lack of professional community also meant that assassins couldn't learn from each other's experiences. Each person had to make the same mistakes, face the same challenges, and solve the same problems independently. This inefficiency made the profession even more dangerous and reduced the chances of long-term survival. Religious isolation was another crushing burden. Medieval society was deeply religious, and participation in religious life was essential for social acceptance and psychological well-being. But how could an assassin participate in religious services while carrying the weight of multiple murders? How could they confess their sins without exposing themselves? How could they seek spiritual comfort when their very existence was an affront to everything their religion taught? Some assassins abandoned religion entirely, deciding that if they were damned anyway, there was no point in maintaining the pretense of faith. Others became obsessively religious, desperately seeking forgiveness for sins they continued to commit. Neither approach provided real peace or community. The inability to seek help when needed was perhaps the most practical consequence of social isolation. If an assassin was injured, they couldn't go to a physician without risking exposure. If they were sick, they had to suffer alone. If they were in legal trouble, they couldn't seek help from friends or family. They were completely dependent on their own resources, with no safety net and no support system. This isolation also made assassins vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. Employers knew that assassins had no one to turn to for advice or support, making them easier to cheat, threaten, or control. The loneliness made assassins desperate for any form of human connection, even if it came from people who were using them. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation were severe. Many assassins developed symptoms that we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and personality disorders. They became suspicious, paranoid, and unable to trust anyone. Some developed elaborate fantasy relationships with imaginary companions. Others talked to themselves constantly, desperate for any form of conversation. The isolation also affected their ability to function in normal social situations. After years of maintaining false identities and viewing everyone as a potential threat, many assassins lost the ability to interact naturally with other people. They became awkward, suspicious, and obviously different from normal members of society. This made them more conspicuous and increased their risk of exposure. Some assassins tried to cope with isolation by adopting pets, dogs, cats, or birds that could provide companionship without the risk of betrayal. But even these relationships were dangerous. A pet could give away an assassin's location, create emotional vulnerability, or simply become another burden in a life that was already impossibly difficult. The irony of the assassin's isolation was that it was both necessary for survival and destructive to the soul. The very thing that kept them alive, their separation from normal human society, was also what made their lives unbearable. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, unable to escape without facing death, but unable to truly live while remaining inside. In the end, the social isolation of medieval assassins was perhaps more cruel than any physical torture. It stripped away everything that made life meaningful: love, friendship, family, community, belonging. It left them as hollow shells, going through the motions of existence without any of the connections that give life purpose and joy. They were alive, but they were not living. They survived, but they had nothing to survive for. The most tragic aspect of this isolation was that it was largely self-imposed. While external circumstances forced people into the profession, the decision to maintain complete secrecy was often a choice made out of fear rather than necessity. Some assassins might have been able to maintain limited relationships if they had been willing to accept greater risks, but the fear of exposure was so overwhelming that they chose complete isolation instead. This fear was not irrational. The consequences of exposure were indeed severe. But the psychological cost of total isolation was often worse than the physical dangers they were trying to avoid. Many assassins reached a point where they no longer cared about survival because they had nothing left to live for. The isolation that was meant to protect them ultimately destroyed them more completely than any enemy could have. The few assassins who managed to escape the profession often found that the damage was permanent. Years of isolation and deception had left them unable to form normal relationships or trust other people. They remained outsiders for the rest of their lives, carrying the invisible scars of their former profession long after they had abandoned it. Fear was the constant companion of every medieval assassin, not just the rational fear of being caught or killed, but a deep, pervasive terror that colored every moment of their existence. This wasn't the temporary fear that soldiers might feel before a battle, or that criminals might experience during a heist. This was a permanent state of anxiety that never ended, never lessened, and gradually ate away at their sanity. The fear began with the simple reality of their situation. They were wanted criminals whose very existence was a capital offense. In a world where justice was swift and brutal, where torture was an accepted method of extracting confessions, and where execution was a public spectacle, an assassin lived with the knowledge that discovery meant not just death, but prolonged agony followed by death. But the fear went deeper than just the threat of legal punishment. Assassins had to worry about revenge from their victims' families, betrayal by their employers, competition from other assassins, and the simple bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every person they encountered could be an enemy. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound in the night could signal their doom. The hypervigilance required to survive in this environment was mentally and physically exhausting. An assassin could never truly relax, never let their guard down, never assume they were safe. They had to constantly scan their surroundings for threats, plan escape routes from every location, and maintain multiple contingency plans for every situation. Sleep became a luxury that few assassins could afford. How could they rest when unconsciousness meant vulnerability? Many developed chronic insomnia, surviving on brief naps taken in hidden locations during daylight hours. Others slept with weapons in their hands, starting awake at the slightest sound. The lack of proper rest compounded their other problems, making them more prone to mistakes and less able to think clearly. The fear of betrayal was particularly corrosive. In a profession where trust could get you killed, assassins had to assume that everyone was a potential enemy. This included their employers, who had obvious reasons to eliminate assassins who knew too much about their business. It included other criminals, who might sell information to save themselves. It even included innocent people who might stumble upon their secrets accidentally. This paranoia was often justified, which made it even more destructive. Assassins really were betrayed regularly by people they had trusted. Employers really did eliminate their hired killers to tie up loose ends. Other criminals really did sell information to authorities. The fact that their fears were rational didn't make them any less devastating to their mental health. The fear of discovery created a constant need for deception that was mentally exhausting. Every conversation required careful thought about what information to reveal and what to conceal. Every relationship had to be managed to prevent too much intimacy or trust. Every action had to be evaluated for its potential to expose their true identity. This constant deception created a strange form of psychological fragmentation. Assassins often developed multiple personalities, not in the clinical sense, but as a practical necessity. They had to become different people for different situations, maintaining separate identities, mannerisms, and even belief systems. The mental effort required to keep these identities separate and consistent was enormous. The fear also manifested in physical symptoms. Many assassins developed nervous habits, twitching, stammering, compulsive behaviors that helped them cope with stress, but also made them more conspicuous. Some suffered from panic attacks, sudden episodes of overwhelming terror that could strike at any moment. Others developed chronic pain, headaches, and digestive problems caused by constant stress. The unpredictability of their profession made the fear even worse. A soldier knew when they were going into battle and could prepare mentally for the danger. An assassin never knew when their next job would come, how dangerous it would be, or whether they would survive it. They lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the next crisis, the next threat, the next brush with death. The fear of failure was almost as bad as the fear of discovery. A failed assassination attempt didn't just mean losing payment, it meant creating powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to hunt down the person who had tried to kill them. It meant exposure, pursuit, and almost certain death. The pressure to succeed on every job was overwhelming, and the knowledge that a single mistake could be fatal made every assignment a potential death sentence. Religious fear added another layer of terror. Medieval people believed deeply in heaven and hell, in divine judgment and eternal punishment. An assassin faced not just earthly consequences for their crimes, but the prospect of eternal damnation. The weight of this spiritual terror was often harder to bear than physical dangers. Some assassins tried to find religious justification for their actions, convincing themselves that they were serving God's will by eliminating evil people. Others sought absolution through confession, though this was extremely dangerous. Many simply tried to suppress their religious beliefs, but the fear of hell remained, lurking in the back of their minds like a constant whisper of doom. The fear of aging and infirmity was particularly acute for assassins. Their profession required physical capability, quick reflexes, and mental sharpness. As they grew older, they became less effective and more vulnerable. But they couldn't simply retire. They knew too much, had too many enemies, and possessed no legitimate skills that would allow them to earn a living in normal society. Many older assassins lived in terror of the day when their abilities would fail them, when they would be too slow to escape, too weak to fight, or too confused to maintain their deceptions. They faced the prospect of dying not in glorious battle or peaceful old age, but as broken, hunted animals, alone and afraid. The fear of madness was another constant worry. The psychological pressures of the profession were enormous, and assassins could see the effects on their own minds. They noticed their increasing paranoia, their growing inability to trust or love, their gradual disconnection from normal human emotions. Many feared that they were slowly going insane, and this fear often became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The cumulative effect of all these fears was a state of chronic anxiety that made normal life impossible. Assassins couldn't enjoy simple pleasures because they were always watching for threats. They couldn't form relationships because they couldn't trust anyone. They couldn't plan for the future because they didn't expect to have one. This constant fear also made them more dangerous and unpredictable. A terrified person is capable of extreme violence, and assassins who felt cornered or threatened might lash out at innocent people. The fear that was meant to keep them alive sometimes drove them to actions that ensured their destruction. The irony was that the very fear that helped assassins survive also made their lives unbearable. They became so focused on avoiding death that they forgot how to live. They were so afraid of being discovered that they disappeared even from themselves, becoming ghosts haunting the edges of society, neither fully alive nor completely dead. In the end, the constant fear that defined the assassin's existence was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their profession. It robbed them of peace, joy, love, and hope. It turned every moment into a potential crisis and every person into a potential enemy. It made them prisoners of their own terror, trapped in a cage of anxiety that they could never escape, even in death. The medieval assassin's body was a tool of their trade, but it was a tool that was constantly being damaged, worn down, and pushed beyond its limits. The physical demands of the profession were brutal, and the lack of proper medical care meant that injuries and illnesses that might be minor inconveniences for other people could be death sentences for assassins. Let's start with the most obvious physical challenge: violence. Assassination attempts rarely went smoothly, and assassins frequently found themselves in life-or-death struggles with their targets or their targets' guards. Medieval combat was brutal and messy, involving crude weapons and no protective gear. A single fight could leave an assassin with broken bones, deep cuts, internal injuries, or permanent disabilities. But even successful assassinations took a physical toll. The stress of planning and executing a kill caused measurable damage to the body. Chronic stress elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones, leading to cardiovascular problems, digestive issues, and immune system dysfunction. Many assassins developed ulcers, heart conditions, and other stress-related ailments that shortened their lives even if they avoided violent death. The lifestyle itself was physically destructive. Assassins often had to travel long distances on foot, carrying heavy packs and sleeping rough. They might spend days or weeks hiding in uncomfortable positions, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. They frequently went without adequate food, water, or shelter, weakening their bodies and making them more susceptible to disease. Sleep deprivation was a constant problem. The hypervigilance required for survival made it difficult to get proper rest, and the irregular schedule of their work disrupted normal sleep patterns. Chronic sleep deprivation affected every aspect of physical health, from immune function to wound healing to cognitive performance. Many assassins developed chronic fatigue that made their already difficult job even harder. Malnutrition was another serious issue. Assassins often couldn't afford good food, and their need to remain inconspicuous meant they couldn't always eat when they were hungry. They might go days without a proper meal, surviving on scraps and whatever they could steal or scavenge. This poor nutrition weakened their bodies, slowed their reflexes, and made them more vulnerable to disease. The weapons they used were dangerous not just to their targets, but to themselves. Medieval daggers and swords were crude instruments that could easily cut the user if handled improperly. Poisons were particularly hazardous. Many assassins accidentally poisoned themselves while preparing or applying toxic substances. The lack of proper safety equipment meant that every tool of their trade was a potential source of injury. Disguises and false identities often required physical modifications that were harmful to health. An assassin might need to change their appearance by altering their posture, gait, or facial expressions in ways that caused chronic pain. They might bind their bodies to change their apparent gender or social class, restricting circulation and breathing. Some even resorted to self-mutilation, scarring their faces or removing fingers to create more convincing disguises. The constant stress of maintaining false identities had physical manifestations. Many assassins developed nervous tics, tremors, or other involuntary movements. Some suffered from chronic headaches, muscle tension, or joint pain caused by the psychological pressure of their situation. The mind-body connection meant that mental anguish translated directly into physical suffering. Substance abuse was common among assassins, and it took a severe toll on their bodies. Alcohol was the most readily available escape from the psychological horrors of their profession, but chronic drinking led to liver damage, brain dysfunction, and increased risk of accidents and violence. Some assassins used opium or other drugs to manage pain or anxiety, but these substances were addictive and ultimately made their problems worse. The lack of proper medical care was perhaps the most serious physical challenge assassins faced. They couldn't seek help from physicians without risking exposure, so they had to treat their own injuries and illnesses with whatever crude remedies they could find or afford. A simple infection that could be easily treated today might kill a medieval assassin who had no access to proper medicine. Many assassins developed chronic conditions that would have been manageable with proper care but became debilitating without treatment. Arthritis from sleeping on cold, hard surfaces. Respiratory problems from exposure to smoke, dust, and harsh weather. Dental problems from poor nutrition and lack of care. Eye problems from working in dim light and constant strain. The physical signs of their profession made assassins increasingly conspicuous as they aged. Scars from fights, calluses from weapons, the distinctive gait of someone who was always ready to run or fight. These markers could give them away to observant enemies. The very experience that made them more effective also made them more recognizable and therefore more vulnerable. Sexually transmitted diseases were another serious health risk. Assassins often used prostitutes for companionship and information, and the lack of medical knowledge about disease transmission meant that infections spread rapidly. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other diseases could cause severe health problems and even death, and there were no effective treatments available. The physical demands of the profession meant that assassins had very short careers. Most were physically broken by their work within a few years, if they survived that long. Those who managed to avoid violent death often died young from the cumulative effects of stress, malnutrition, substance abuse, and untreated medical conditions. Pregnancy was a particular challenge for female assassins. The physical demands of the profession were incompatible with pregnancy, but contraception was unreliable and abortion was dangerous. Many female assassins died from complications of pregnancy or childbirth, or were forced to abandon their children to continue their work. The aging process was accelerated by the harsh conditions of their lives. A 30-year-old assassin might look and feel like a 50-year-old farmer. Their bodies were worn out by constant stress, poor nutrition, and physical trauma. They developed the stooped posture, gray hair, and lined faces of much older people. Even successful assassins who managed to accumulate some wealth found that money couldn't buy back their health. The damage done by years of abuse was often irreversible. They might be able to afford better food and shelter, but they couldn't undo the effects of chronic stress, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. The physical toll of the profession also affected their mental state. Chronic pain, fatigue, and illness made it harder to think clearly, plan effectively, and react quickly to threats. The deterioration of their bodies paralleled the deterioration of their minds, creating a downward spiral that was difficult to escape. In the end, the physical demands of being a medieval assassin were simply unsustainable. The human body wasn't designed to withstand the constant stress, violence, and deprivation that the profession required. Those who entered this line of work were essentially trading their long-term health and longevity for short-term survival. And it was a bargain that few lived to regret, because few lived long enough to see the full consequences of their choice. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of the assassin's profession was how it gradually corrupted every aspect of their moral being. What began as desperate acts of survival slowly transformed into something far darker, a complete abandonment of the ethical principles that separate humans from monsters. This moral decay was not sudden or dramatic. It was a slow erosion that ate away at the soul until nothing recognizable remained. The first kill was always justified. The assassin told themselves they had no choice, that circumstances had forced them into this terrible act. They were victims of fate, of poverty, of a cruel world that offered no alternatives. This narrative of victimhood provided psychological protection against the full weight of what they had done. They weren't murderers. They were survivors doing what they had to do. But justification is a dangerous drug. Each subsequent kill became easier to rationalize. The second victim was a bad person who deserved to die. The third was a threat to innocent people. The fourth was simply business, nothing personal, just a job that needed to be done. With each rationalization, the moral barriers became weaker, the justifications more hollow, the distance between the assassin and their humanity greater. Drowning was occasionally used as a method of assassination, particularly in coastal areas or cities with rivers and canals. The advantage of drowning was that it could sometimes be made to appear accidental, especially if the victim was known to drink heavily or had reason to be near water. However, drowning required overpowering the victim and holding them underwater for several minutes, which was physically demanding and left evidence of struggle. Many drowning attempts failed because the assassin underestimated the victim's strength and desperation. A person fighting for their life could display surprising strength and determination, often managing to escape or injure their attacker. Even successful drownings often left evidence of violence, bruises, scratches, or torn clothing that would alert investigators to the true cause of death. Fire was rarely used as a direct method of assassination, but it was sometimes employed to destroy evidence or create diversions. An assassin might set fire to a building after poisoning or stabbing their target, hoping to destroy evidence of the murder and make the death appear accidental. However, arson was a serious crime in medieval times, often punishable by death, and it created additional risks for the assassin. The use of fire also required careful planning and timing. The assassin had to ensure that the fire would destroy the evidence without spreading to other buildings or endangering innocent people. They also had to escape the area before the fire was discovered, which could be difficult if they had to wait for the flames to take hold properly. Staged accidents were perhaps the most sophisticated form of medieval assassination, requiring extensive planning, detailed knowledge of the target's habits and considerable skill in execution. The goal was to make the death appear completely natural or accidental, avoiding any investigation or suspicion. However, staging convincing accidents was extremely difficult with medieval technology and knowledge. Common staged accidents included falls from heights, kicks from horses, collapses of buildings or structures, and various forms of accidental poisoning. Each of these methods required the assassin to manipulate circumstances in ways that would appear natural while ensuring that the target would actually die from the staged incident. The complexity of staging accidents meant that they were usually reserved for high-value targets where the additional effort and risk were justified by the payment or importance of the contract. Most assassins lacked the skills, resources, and patience necessary to execute convincing staged accidents, making this method relatively rare in practice. The seasonal and environmental factors that affected assassination methods were significant. Poison was more effective in summer when higher temperatures accelerated decomposition and made it harder to determine the exact cause of death. Blade attacks were easier in winter when heavy clothing could conceal weapons and bloodstains. Drowning was more plausible in spring when rivers were swollen with snowmelt and travel by water was more common. Weather conditions also affected the choice of methods. Rain could wash away blood evidence but made it harder to use fire effectively. Snow could preserve evidence longer, but also provided cover for approaching targets. Wind could carry the sounds of struggle or help spread fires, depending on the assassin's needs. The urban versus rural environment significantly influenced assassination techniques. In cities, assassins had to contend with more witnesses, better law enforcement, and limited escape routes. But they also had more opportunities to blend into crowds and access to better equipment and poisons. In rural areas, there were fewer witnesses, and escape routes were more numerous, but targets were often better protected by loyal retainers, and the assassin's presence was more likely to be noticed. The social class of the target also determined which methods were most appropriate. Killing a peasant could be accomplished with crude methods and little planning, as the death was unlikely to be thoroughly investigated. Assassinating a noble required more sophisticated techniques and careful planning to avoid the extensive investigation and harsh punishment that would follow. Religious and cultural factors influenced both the choice of methods and their effectiveness. In strongly Christian regions, certain methods might be avoided because they were associated with witchcraft or demonic practices. In areas with different religious traditions, other considerations might apply. The assassin had to understand not just the physical aspects of their methods, but also their cultural and symbolic meanings. The availability of medical knowledge and treatment affected the choice of assassination methods. In regions with skilled physicians, poisons had to be more sophisticated to avoid detection and treatment. In areas with limited medical care, cruder methods might be sufficient because the victim was unlikely to receive effective treatment even if they survived the initial attack. The legal system also influenced assassination techniques. In regions where torture was commonly used to extract confessions, assassins preferred methods that would kill quickly and leave no witnesses. In areas with more lenient legal systems, they might be willing to use methods that carried higher risks of capture because the consequences of being caught were less severe. The economic factors affecting method selection were significant. Expensive poisons like arsenic were reserved for high-paying contracts, while cheap methods like strangulation were used for routine killings. The assassin's financial situation often determined which techniques they could afford to use, regardless of which might be most effective for a particular situation. The psychological impact of different methods on the assassins themselves was profound and often overlooked. Methods that required close physical contact with the victim, like stabbing or strangulation, were more traumatic for the assassin and more likely to cause lasting psychological damage. Methods that allowed distance, like poison, were easier to cope with psychologically, but often less reliable in practice. The learning curve for different assassination methods varied considerably. Simple techniques like clubbing someone to death could be learned quickly, but were crude and risky. Sophisticated methods like poison preparation required years of study and practice, but offered better chances of success and escape. Most assassins never had the time or resources to master the more advanced techniques. The failure rates of different methods were alarmingly high. Poison attempts failed more often than they succeeded due to incorrect dosages, poor preparation, or the victim's natural resistance. Blade attacks failed because the assassin missed vital organs or the victim fought back successfully. Even the simplest methods like strangulation could fail if the assassin lacked the physical strength or determination to complete the act. The evidence left by different methods varied considerably and affected the assassin's chances of escape and survival. Poison could sometimes leave no obvious evidence, making investigation difficult. Blade wounds clearly indicated murder, but might not point to a specific perpetrator. Blunt force trauma was obvious and messy, but could sometimes be attributed to accidents or random violence. The seasonal availability of materials affected method selection throughout the year. Certain poisonous plants were only available at specific times, forcing assassins to plan their contracts around natural cycles. Weather conditions affected the preservation and transportation of materials, making some methods impractical during certain seasons. The regional variations in assassination methods reflected local conditions, available materials, and cultural preferences. Mediterranean assassins might favor poisons derived from local plants, while Northern European assassins might rely more on blade weapons due to different environmental conditions. These regional specializations sometimes made assassins more effective in their home territories, but less adaptable when working elsewhere. The evolution of assassination methods over time reflected changes in technology, medicine, and law enforcement. As medical knowledge improved, poisons had to become more sophisticated to avoid detection. As law enforcement became more effective, assassins had to develop more subtle methods to avoid capture. This constant arms race between assassins and their opponents drove innovation in the methods of murder. The training and knowledge transfer for assassination methods was informal and often incomplete. Master assassins might teach their techniques to selected apprentices, but much knowledge was lost when experienced killers died or retired. This lack of systematic education meant that many assassins had to rediscover techniques that had been known to previous generations. The international exchange of assassination techniques was limited by communication and travel difficulties, but it did occur. Assassins who fled from one region to another sometimes brought new methods with them, and mercenaries and soldiers returning from foreign wars might introduce techniques they had observed abroad. This cross-pollination of methods gradually spread more effective techniques across different regions. The documentation of assassination methods was obviously limited, as practitioners had no interest in leaving written records of their techniques. Most of our knowledge comes from legal records of failed attempts, confessions extracted under torture, and the observations of physicians who treated poisoning victims. This incomplete record makes it difficult to assess the true effectiveness of different methods. The moral and ethical considerations surrounding different assassination methods were complex and varied among different practitioners. Some assassins preferred methods they considered more honorable or less painful for their victims, while others chose techniques based purely on effectiveness and safety. These personal codes often reflected the assassin's background, religious beliefs, and psychological makeup. The gender differences in method selection were significant, reflecting both physical capabilities and social expectations. Female assassins were more likely to use poison, both because it didn't require physical strength and because it fit cultural stereotypes about women's supposed knowledge of herbs and cooking. Male assassins were more likely to use blade weapons or blunt force, methods that were associated with masculine strength and directness. In conclusion, the methods used by medieval assassins were crude, unreliable, and often as dangerous to the user as to the intended victim. They reflected the desperate circumstances of the people who employed them. Individuals with limited resources, minimal training, and no support systems. The romantic image of the skilled assassin with exotic weapons and sophisticated techniques was largely a myth. The reality was far grimmer. Desperate people using desperate methods to commit desperate acts, usually with tragic consequences for everyone involved. Once a murder was discovered and identified as an assassination, the medieval world's crude but often effective investigative machinery would grind into motion. For the assassin, this marked the beginning of what was often the final chapter of their story, a desperate flight from justice that usually ended in capture, torture, and execution. Understanding how these investigations worked reveals another layer of why being a medieval assassin was such a terrible profession. Even successful killings often led to the assassin's doom. Medieval law enforcement was far from the sophisticated police work we know today, but it was not as primitive as many people assume. Local authorities, church officials, and noble administrators had developed various methods for investigating crimes and tracking down perpetrators. While these methods were often brutal and sometimes misdirected, they could be surprisingly effective, especially when dealing with outsiders who didn't understand local customs and networks. The first phase of any investigation was the discovery and examination of the body. Medieval physicians and learned men, while lacking modern forensic knowledge, were often quite skilled at determining cause of death and identifying signs of foul play. They could distinguish between natural death and murder, identify weapon types from wound patterns, and sometimes even estimate the time of death based on the body's condition. Poison cases were particularly challenging to investigate, but experienced physicians could often identify the symptoms and narrow down the possible substances used. They would examine the victim's final hours, interview witnesses about unusual behavior or symptoms, and sometimes even taste small amounts of the victim's food or drink to identify foreign substances. This was obviously dangerous, but medieval physicians were often willing to take such risks in pursuit of justice or to protect their own reputations. The examination of the crime scene, while not as systematic as modern forensic investigation, could still yield valuable clues. Investigators looked for signs of struggle, unusual objects or substances, evidence of forced entry, and anything that seemed out of place. They paid particular attention to the victim's personal effects, looking for missing items that might indicate robbery, or specific items that might have been planted to mislead the investigation. Witness testimony was crucial to medieval investigations, but it was also highly unreliable. People's memories were often faulty, their observations incomplete, and their testimonies colored by personal biases, fears, and loyalties. Investigators had to sort through conflicting accounts, identify reliable witnesses, and piece together a coherent narrative from fragmentary and often contradictory information. The social dynamics of medieval communities played a crucial role in investigations. In small towns and villages, everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were immediately noticed and remembered. An assassin who had spent time in the area preparing for their attack would likely have been observed by multiple people, even if they had tried to remain inconspicuous. However, these same social dynamics could also protect assassins who had local connections or who had successfully integrated themselves into the community. A well-disguised assassin who had spent months building a false identity might have allies who would provide false testimony or refuse to cooperate with investigators. The tight-knit nature of medieval communities could work both for and against the pursuit of justice. The role of informants was crucial in medieval investigations. Authorities often relied on criminals, servants, and other marginal figures to provide information about suspicious activities or individuals. These informants were motivated by various factors: fear of punishment for their own crimes, hope of reward, personal grudges, or simple civic duty. However, their information was often unreliable, and they sometimes provided false testimony to settle personal scores or deflect suspicion from themselves. The investigation of an assassination typically began with identifying the victim's enemies and anyone who might have benefited from their death. This process could be complex and time-consuming, especially if the victim was a prominent figure with many political, business, or personal rivals. Investigators had to examine financial records, political alliances, family disputes, and romantic entanglements to identify potential motives for murder. The questioning of suspects and witnesses was often conducted under torture, which was considered a legitimate and necessary tool for extracting truth in medieval justice systems. While modern people rightly condemn torture as both immoral and unreliable, medieval investigators believed it was essential for overcoming the natural tendency of criminals to lie and conceal their crimes. The use of torture in investigations created particular problems for assassins. Even if they managed to avoid immediate capture, they lived with the knowledge that anyone who knew about their activities might eventually be tortured into revealing information. This included their handlers, fellow criminals, family members, and even innocent people who had observed them during their preparations. The fear of torture was so pervasive that it affected every aspect of an assassin's behavior. They had to assume that any information known by another person might eventually be extracted through torture, which meant that maintaining secrecy was not just important, but absolutely critical for survival. This fear also made assassins more likely to eliminate potential witnesses, even innocent ones, rather than risk exposure. The pursuit phase of an investigation began once authorities had identified a suspect or developed leads about the assassin's identity or whereabouts. Medieval pursuit was hampered by limited communication and transportation, but it was aided by the relatively small and interconnected nature of medieval society. News of a wanted criminal could spread quickly through networks of merchants, pilgrims, and officials. The methods used to track fleeing assassins were varied and often ingenious. Authorities would send descriptions to other towns and cities, post rewards for information, and coordinate with local officials along likely escape routes. They would monitor ports, bridges, and other choke points where travelers had to pass. They would also investigate the assassin's known associates and family members, both to gather information and to use them as bait to lure the fugitive into a trap. The use of professional bounty hunters and thief-takers was common in medieval pursuit operations. These individuals were often former criminals themselves who had intimate knowledge of criminal methods and hideouts. They were motivated by financial rewards and sometimes by the promise of pardons for their own crimes. While they could be effective at tracking down fugitives, they were also unreliable and sometimes more interested in collecting rewards than in ensuring justice. The role of the church in investigations and pursuits was significant. Church officials had their own networks of communication and authority that could be mobilized to track down criminals. They also controlled many of the places where fugitives might seek sanctuary, giving them leverage in negotiations with fleeing assassins. However, the church's involvement could also complicate investigations, especially when religious and secular authorities had conflicting interests or jurisdictions. The international aspects of medieval pursuit were particularly challenging. An assassin who fled across political boundaries might escape the jurisdiction of local authorities, but they also entered unfamiliar territory, where they lacked local knowledge and connections. Different kingdoms had different laws, different investigative methods, and different levels of cooperation with foreign authorities. Some regions had formal agreements for the extradition of criminals, but these were often limited in scope and effectiveness. Political tensions between different rulers could make cooperation difficult or impossible. An assassin who had fled from one kingdom to another might find themselves safe from their original pursuers but vulnerable to new threats from local criminals or authorities. The use of spies and intelligence networks in pursuit operations was more sophisticated than many people realize. Medieval rulers and wealthy individuals often maintained networks of informants and agents who could gather information about criminal activities and track down fugitives. These networks were particularly effective in major cities and trade centers where information flowed freely. The economic aspects of pursuit operations were significant. Investigations and manhunts were expensive, requiring the time and resources of many officials, soldiers, and informants. The costs had to be weighed against the importance of the victim and the likelihood of success. A wealthy noble's murder would justify extensive investigation and pursuit, while the killing of a poor peasant might receive only cursory attention. The duration of pursuit operations varied widely depending on the resources available and the importance of the case. Some manhunts lasted for years, with authorities continuing to follow leads and investigate sightings long after the initial crime. Others were abandoned after a few weeks when it became clear that the assassin had successfully escaped or died during their flight. The psychological warfare aspects of pursuit were often as important as the physical tracking. Authorities would spread rumors about the assassin's crimes, offer rewards for information, and publicize the punishments that awaited captured criminals. The goal was to make the assassin feel isolated, paranoid, and hopeless, increasing the chances that they would make mistakes or surrender voluntarily. The role of luck and chance in pursuit operations cannot be underestimated. Many assassins were caught not through brilliant detective work but through random encounters, coincidental sightings, or simple bad luck. A fleeing assassin might be recognized by someone from their past, caught in a routine check of travelers, or betrayed by a chance remark overheard in a tavern. The effectiveness of medieval investigations and pursuits was actually quite high, especially considering the technological limitations of the time. Studies of surviving legal records suggest that a significant percentage of assassins were eventually caught and punished, though the exact numbers are difficult to determine due to incomplete records and the secretive nature of the profession. The methods used to avoid capture were varied and often desperate. Assassins would change their appearance, adopt new identities, flee to distant regions, or seek sanctuary in religious institutions. Some would join military units or merchant caravans to gain protection and cover for their movements. Others would hide in criminal underworlds or remote wilderness areas where authorities were less likely to search. The use of disguises was crucial for evading capture, but it was also risky. A poorly executed disguise could actually draw more attention than the assassin's natural appearance. Changing one's appearance also required resources, different clothes, hair dyes, makeup, and sometimes even surgical alterations. Many assassins lacked the money or skills necessary to create convincing disguises. The psychological toll of being hunted was enormous. Assassins lived in constant fear of discovery, unable to trust anyone or stay in one place for long. They had to constantly watch for signs of pursuit, evaluate every person they encountered as a potential threat, and be ready to flee at a moment's notice. This stress often led to poor decision-making, paranoid behavior, and eventual capture. The impact of successful investigations on the assassination profession was significant. When authorities managed to uncover and destroy assassination networks, it disrupted criminal operations for years and deterred others from entering the profession. The public execution of captured assassins served as a powerful warning to potential criminals and helped maintain social order. However, the brutal methods used in investigations and punishments also had negative consequences. Torture and harsh interrogation techniques sometimes produced false confessions and led to the punishment of innocent people. The fear of investigation could make witnesses reluctant to come forward with information, hampering legitimate law enforcement efforts. The regional variations in investigative methods reflected different legal traditions, available resources, and cultural attitudes toward crime and punishment. Some regions were known for their thorough and effective investigations, while others had reputations for corruption or incompetence. These differences affected where assassins chose to operate and where they fled when pursued. The evolution of investigative techniques over time reflected changes in legal systems, administrative capabilities, and social organization. As medieval societies became more sophisticated and centralized, their ability to investigate crimes and pursue criminals improved correspondingly. This made the assassination profession increasingly dangerous and contributed to its eventual decline. The documentation of investigations provides some of our best historical evidence about medieval assassination. Court records, witness testimonies, and official correspondence offer detailed insights into how these crimes were committed, investigated, and punished. However, these records are biased toward cases that were successfully solved, giving us an incomplete picture of the profession as a whole. The moral and ethical dimensions of medieval investigations were complex. While the pursuit of justice was generally seen as righteous and necessary, the methods used often violated what we would now consider basic human rights. The use of torture, collective punishment, and summary execution reflected a different understanding of justice and individual rights than exists in modern societies. In conclusion, the investigation and pursuit of medieval assassins was a complex process that combined primitive forensic techniques with sophisticated intelligence gathering and relentless determination. While many assassins managed to escape immediate capture, the long-term success rate of these investigations was surprisingly high. For the individual assassin, the knowledge that discovery would likely lead to torture and execution added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish existence. The constant fear of pursuit, combined with the isolation and paranoia it created, made the profession even more unbearable and ultimately self-destructive. The medieval world's approach to punishing assassins was designed not merely to end their lives, but to serve as a spectacular deterrent to others who might consider following the same path. The punishments were deliberately brutal, public, and prolonged, intended to demonstrate the full power of authority and the terrible consequences of challenging the social order. For assassins who were caught, death was not just inevitable. It was going to be as horrific as human imagination could devise. The capture of an assassin was only the beginning of their ordeal. Medieval justice systems operated on the principle that the more serious the crime, the more elaborate the punishment should be. Since assassination was considered one of the gravest offenses possible, a crime against God, king, and natural order, the punishments were correspondingly severe. The first phase of punishment was typically interrogation under torture. This was not simply about extracting confessions or information about accomplices, though those were important goals. The torture was also part of the punishment itself, a way of making the assassins suffer for their crimes before the final execution. The methods used were limited only by the imagination and resources of the authorities. The rack was a common torture device, designed to slowly stretch the victim's body until joints dislocated and muscles tore. Assassins would be strapped to the wooden frame and gradually pulled apart while interrogators demanded information about their crimes, their employers, and their methods. The psychological torture was as important as the physical pain. Victims knew that their suffering would continue until they provided satisfactory answers, but they also knew that cooperation would not save them from eventual execution. The strappado was another favored method, involving tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The victim's own body weight would dislocate their shoulders and cause excruciating pain. Weights might be attached to their feet to increase the agony. The beauty of this method from the torturer's perspective was that it could be continued for hours without killing the victim. Hot irons were used to burn flesh and extract confessions. The smell of burning human flesh was considered part of the psychological warfare against the victim and any witnesses. Assassins might have their eyes burned out, their tongues seared, or their genitals mutilated with red-hot metal. These tortures served multiple purposes: punishment, interrogation, and preparation for the final execution. The breaking wheel was reserved for the most serious crimes, including assassination. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel and their limbs systematically broken with iron bars or hammers. The process was slow and methodical, designed to maximize pain and suffering. After all the major bones were broken, the victim might be left on the wheel to die slowly, sometimes taking days to expire. Flaying, or skinning alive, was another punishment sometimes reserved for assassins. The victim's skin would be carefully removed in strips while they were still conscious, causing unimaginable agony. The process required considerable skill to keep the victim alive throughout the ordeal. The removed skin might be displayed as a warning to others, and the victim's body would be left to die slowly from shock and infection. The use of animals in executions added another dimension of horror to medieval punishments. Assassins might be thrown to wild beasts, trampled by horses, or eaten alive by specially trained animals. These methods were particularly popular for public executions because they provided spectacular entertainment for the crowds while demonstrating the power of authority over both human and animal life. Drawing and quartering was perhaps the most infamous punishment for serious crimes like assassination. The victim would be dragged through the streets behind a horse, then hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still alive, and finally cut into quarters. Each part of the body would be displayed in different locations as a warning to potential criminals. The entire process was designed to be as public and horrific as possible. Burning at the stake was another common punishment, particularly when the assassination was connected to heresy or witchcraft. The victim would be tied to a wooden post surrounded by combustible materials and slowly burned to death. The fire was often built to burn slowly, prolonging the agony. Sometimes the victim would be strangled before the flames reached them as an act of mercy, but this was not guaranteed. The public nature of these executions was crucial to their purpose. They were not simply about punishing individual criminals, but about reinforcing social order and demonstrating the consequences of challenging authority. Entire communities would gather to watch executions, which were treated as both entertainment and moral instruction. The crowds at public executions were diverse and enthusiastic. Nobles would attend in their finest clothes, treating the event as a social occasion. Merchants would set up stalls selling food and drink. Children would be brought to witness the consequences of crime. The atmosphere was often festive, with people cheering for particularly creative tortures or dramatic moments in the execution. The psychological impact of public executions on both the victims and the witnesses was profound. For the assassins facing death, the knowledge that their suffering would be witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people added another layer of humiliation and terror to their ordeal. They would die not just in agony, but in shame, their final moments becoming entertainment for the masses. For the witnesses, public executions served as powerful deterrents to criminal behavior. The sight of a human being tortured and killed in the most horrible ways imaginable was intended to create lasting memories that would prevent people from considering similar crimes. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who challenge the established order. However, public executions also had unintended consequences. They sometimes created sympathy for the victims, especially if the punishments seemed excessive or if the condemned person showed courage in the face of death. They could also inspire copycat crimes or revenge attacks against the authorities. Some executions became focal points for social unrest or political opposition. The role of religious officials in executions was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the church supported the death penalty for serious crimes and provided theological justification for harsh punishments. On the other hand, Christian doctrine emphasized mercy and forgiveness, creating tension between religious ideals and practical justice. Priests and monks were typically present at executions to provide spiritual comfort to the condemned and to ensure that proper religious procedures were followed. They would hear final confessions, administer last rites, and sometimes intercede for mercy or a quicker death. However, their primary role was to help the condemned person prepare for the afterlife, not to question the justice of the punishment. The condemned assassins' behavior during their final hours varied widely. Some maintained their innocence to the end, cursing their accusers and proclaiming their defiance. Others confessed their crimes and begged for forgiveness from God and their victims' families. Many simply broke down completely, reduced to gibbering terror by the prospect of their approaching torture and death. The preparation for execution was itself a form of torture. Condemned assassins might spend weeks or months in prison, knowing exactly when and how they would die. They would be fed minimal rations to keep them alive but weak. They might be subjected to additional tortures or interrogations. The psychological pressure of waiting for death was often as devastating as the physical punishments. The final speeches of condemned assassins were considered important parts of the execution ritual. The authorities wanted the condemned to confess their crimes publicly, express remorse, and warn others against following their path. These speeches served as moral instruction for the crowd and validation for the justice system. However, not all assassins cooperated with this expectation. Some used their final moments to proclaim their innocence, denounce their accusers, or deliver defiant messages that undermined the authorities' narrative. Others remained silent, denying the crowd and officials the satisfaction of a proper confession. These acts of defiance, while ultimately futile, represented the last vestige of human dignity in the face of overwhelming power. The executioners themselves were complex figures in medieval society. They were necessary for the functioning of the justice system, but were also social outcasts, feared and despised by the communities they served. Many executioners were hereditary, with the profession passing from father to son because few others would take on such grisly work. The skills required for execution were considerable. A good executioner needed to understand human anatomy, the properties of different torture devices, and the psychology of both victims and crowds. They had to be able to prolong suffering when required, but also to end it quickly when mercy was called for. They needed physical strength, emotional detachment, and a certain theatrical flair for public performances. The pay for executioners was generally good, reflecting both the specialized nature of their work and the social stigma attached to it. They often received fees for each execution, plus additional payments for torture sessions and other services. Some executioners also worked as torturers for hire, offering their services to private individuals who wanted to extract information or punish enemies. The psychological toll on executioners was significant, though it was rarely discussed openly. Many turned to drink to cope with their work. Others developed elaborate rituals or superstitions to distance themselves psychologically from their actions. Some became genuinely sadistic, taking pleasure in the suffering they inflicted. The profession attracted and created individuals who were fundamentally damaged by their work. The regional variations in execution methods reflected different legal traditions, cultural values, and available resources. Some regions were known for particularly creative or brutal punishments, while others favored simpler methods. These differences sometimes influenced where assassins chose to operate, as they might prefer regions with less severe punishments if they were caught. The evolution of execution methods over time reflected changes in technology, legal philosophy, and social attitudes. Some punishments that were common in earlier periods gradually fell out of favor as societies became more sophisticated or as religious attitudes changed. However, the basic principle of making executions public and spectacular remained constant throughout the medieval period. The documentation of executions provides valuable historical evidence about medieval justice systems and social attitudes. Official records, witness accounts, and artistic depictions offer insights into how these events were conducted and perceived. However, these sources are often biased toward the official perspective and may not accurately reflect the experiences of the condemned or the full range of public reactions. The impact of execution methods on the assassination profession was significant. The knowledge that capture would lead to prolonged torture and horrific death served as a powerful deterrent to potential assassins. It also influenced the behavior of active assassins, making them more desperate to avoid capture and more willing to eliminate witnesses or potential informants. The families of executed assassins often faced additional punishments and social stigma. They might be stripped of their property, banished from their communities, or subjected to ongoing harassment and discrimination. Children of executed criminals sometimes found it impossible to find work, marry, or participate normally in society. The punishment extended far beyond the individual criminal to encompass their entire family and social network. The disposal of executed bodies was another aspect of medieval punishment designed to maximize humiliation and deterrence. Bodies might be left hanging in public places for weeks or months until they decomposed completely. They might be dismembered and displayed in different locations throughout the region. Some bodies were thrown into unmarked graves or simply left for animals to consume. The denial of proper burial was considered a particularly severe punishment in medieval Christian society, where proper funeral rites were believed necessary for salvation. The knowledge that their bodies would be desecrated and their souls potentially damned added another layer of terror to the prospect of execution for condemned assassins. The use of execution sites as permanent reminders of justice was common throughout medieval Europe. Gallows, execution blocks, and other instruments of death were often left in place as warnings to potential criminals. Some execution sites became pilgrimage destinations or tourist attractions, drawing visitors who wanted to see where famous criminals had met their ends. The seasonal timing of executions was often significant. Authorities might delay executions until market days or religious festivals when larger crowds would be present. They might also time executions to coincide with political events or to send messages to specific groups or individuals. The scheduling of executions was itself a form of political theater. The international aspects of medieval execution were complex, particularly when dealing with foreign assassins or crimes that crossed political boundaries. Different kingdoms had different laws and punishments, and diplomatic considerations sometimes influenced how executions were conducted. Foreign assassins might be returned to their home countries for punishment, or they might be executed locally as examples to the population. The role of mercy and pardons in the execution process was limited but not non-existent. Rulers sometimes commuted death sentences for political reasons in response to popular pressure or as acts of religious devotion. However, such mercy was rare for assassins, who were considered among the most dangerous and unforgivable criminals. The economic costs of elaborate executions were significant, requiring the time and resources of many officials, executioners, and support staff. The construction of execution devices, the preparation of execution sites, and the management of crowds all required considerable investment. These costs had to be weighed against the perceived benefits of public deterrence and social control. The psychological impact of witnessing executions on medieval populations was profound and lasting. Children who watched public executions carried those memories throughout their lives, shaping their understanding of justice, authority, and human nature. The normalization of extreme violence in public settings contributed to a culture where brutality was accepted as a necessary part of social order. The medical aspects of medieval executions were primitive, but not entirely ignorant. Executioners and officials had practical knowledge about human anatomy and the effects of different tortures and execution methods. They understood how to prolong life and suffering, how to cause maximum pain, and how to ensure that death would eventually occur. This knowledge was gained through experience rather than formal medical training. The artistic and literary representations of executions in medieval culture reflected their central importance in social and moral discourse. Paintings, sculptures, and written accounts of famous executions served both as historical records and as moral instruction. These artistic works often emphasized the justice of the punishments and the righteousness of the authorities while downplaying the human suffering involved. The long-term social effects of public executions extended far beyond their immediate deterrent value. They reinforced hierarchical social structures, normalized violence as a tool of authority, and created a culture of fear that extended throughout society. The knowledge that the state possessed the power and willingness to inflict extreme suffering on its enemies served to maintain social order, but also to suppress dissent and innovation. The gender differences in execution methods reflected medieval attitudes toward women and their supposed moral and physical characteristics. Female assassins might face different punishments than their male counterparts, sometimes more lenient due to assumptions about female weakness, sometimes more severe due to beliefs about the unnaturalness of violent women. The religious dimensions of medieval executions were complex and sometimes contradictory. While the Church supported capital punishment for serious crimes, Christian doctrine also emphasized mercy, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. This tension created ongoing debates about the morality of execution methods and the proper role of religious officials in the process. In conclusion, the punishments and executions faced by medieval assassins were designed to be as horrific and public as possible, serving not just as individual punishments, but as spectacular demonstrations of state power and social order. The knowledge that capture would lead to prolonged torture and agonizing death added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish profession. For those unfortunate enough to be caught, the end was not just death but a carefully orchestrated destruction of body, dignity, and soul that served as a warning to all who might consider following their path. The brutality of these punishments reflected the medieval world's understanding of justice, deterrence, and the proper relationship between individual and authority, an understanding that made the assassin's profession not just dangerous, but ultimately hopeless. The medieval assassin left behind more than just bodies and broken families. They created a legacy of fear that permeated every level of society, fundamentally altering how people lived, worked, and related to one another. This legacy extended far beyond the immediate victims of assassination, creating ripple effects that touched entire communities and shaped the development of medieval civilization in profound and lasting ways. The most immediate impact was on the potential targets themselves, the nobles, merchants, church officials, and other prominent figures who lived with the constant knowledge that someone might be planning their death. This awareness transformed their daily lives in ways both subtle and dramatic. Simple activities like eating, sleeping, and traveling became exercises in risk assessment and security planning. Consider the case of a wealthy merchant in 14th century Florence. Before the rise of professional assassination, such a person might have lived relatively openly, conducting business in public spaces, dining in taverns, and traveling with minimal protection. But as assassination became more common and sophisticated, the same merchant would have to employ food tasters, sleep in different locations each night, vary his travel routes, and surround himself with bodyguards whose loyalty was never entirely certain. The psychological toll on these potential targets was enormous. They lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, unable to trust anyone completely, always watching for signs of danger. Many developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, paranoid tendencies, and other stress-related conditions. The quality of their lives deteriorated even if they were never actually attacked, because the mere possibility of assassination was enough to poison their daily existence. The impact on family relationships was particularly devastating. How could a noble trust his own servants when any one of them might be a disguised assassin? How could he show affection to his children when displays of emotion might reveal vulnerabilities that could be exploited? How could he maintain intimate relationships with his wife when pillow talk might be overheard by hidden enemies? Many prominent figures became increasingly isolated, surrounding themselves with ever smaller circles of trusted associates while growing more suspicious of everyone else. This isolation often made them more effective targets, as their reduced social connections made it easier for assassins to approach them without being noticed by friends or allies who might have provided protection. The economic impact of assassination fear was substantial. Wealthy individuals spent enormous sums on security measures: bodyguards, fortified residences, food tasters, and various forms of protection. This money was diverted from productive economic activities like trade, manufacturing, and investment, reducing overall economic growth and prosperity. The insurance industry, such as it was in medieval times, had to adapt to the reality of assassination risk. Merchants and nobles sought ways to protect their investments and provide for their families in case of violent death. This led to the development of more sophisticated financial instruments and risk-sharing arrangements, but it also increased the cost of doing business for everyone. The travel industry was particularly affected. Prominent individuals could no longer travel alone or with minimal protection. They required armed escorts, secure accommodations, and carefully planned routes that avoided known danger areas. This made travel more expensive and time-consuming, reducing trade and communication between different regions. The impact on governance was profound and lasting. Rulers and administrators had to devote increasing resources to personal security, reducing the time and money available for actual governing. Decision-making processes became more secretive and centralized as leaders tried to limit the number of people who knew about their plans and activities. The development of intelligence networks and spy systems was largely driven by assassination fears. Rulers needed to know who might be plotting against them, what threats were emerging, and how to counter potential attacks. This led to the creation of sophisticated surveillance systems that monitored not just foreign enemies but domestic subjects as well. The legal system evolved in response to assassination threats. New laws were created specifically targeting assassins and their supporters. Punishments became more severe and more public as authorities tried to deter potential killers through fear. The burden of proof was often reduced in assassination cases, making it easier to convict suspects, but also increasing the risk of executing innocent people. The impact on religious institutions was complex and contradictory. On one hand, churches and monasteries became places of sanctuary where people could seek protection from assassins. On the other hand, religious officials themselves became targets when they became involved in political disputes or accumulated too much wealth and power. The church's response to assassination was to emphasize both divine protection and moral condemnation. They preached that God would protect the righteous while punishing the wicked, but they also invested heavily in physical security measures for their own institutions and personnel. This created a tension between spiritual ideals and practical necessities that was never fully resolved. The cultural impact of assassination fear can be seen in the literature, art, and folklore of the medieval period. Stories of poisoned cups, hidden daggers, and mysterious deaths became common themes in popular culture. These tales served both as entertainment and as cautionary warnings about the dangers of ambition, wealth, and power. The artistic depictions of assassination often emphasized the moral consequences of murder while also providing detailed information about methods and techniques. This created a paradox, where the very works that condemned assassination also served as instruction manuals for potential killers. The fascination with assassination in medieval culture reflected both horror at the practice and a morbid curiosity about its methods. The impact on social mobility was significant. The fear of assassination made it more dangerous to rise in social status, as increased prominence brought increased risk. This may have contributed to the relative social stability of medieval society, as people were discouraged from seeking advancement that might make them targets. Conversely, the existence of assassination as a tool of social control may have prevented some legitimate social changes and reforms. Potential reformers and innovators had to weigh their desire for change against the risk of violent death. This conservative pressure helped maintain existing power structures, but also slowed social and economic development. The international implications of assassination fear were substantial. Diplomatic relations became more complex and dangerous as ambassadors and negotiators faced the risk of assassination in foreign courts. This led to the development of more formal diplomatic protocols and immunities, but it also made international cooperation more difficult and expensive. Trade relationships were affected as merchants had to consider assassination risks when deciding where to do business and with whom to partner. Some regions developed reputations as particularly dangerous for foreign businessmen, reducing their economic opportunities and international connections. The military implications were also significant. The fear of assassination led to changes in military organization and tactics. Commanders had to protect themselves, not just from enemy armies, but from potential assassins within their own ranks. This led to more complex command structures and security procedures that sometimes reduced military effectiveness. The development of personal armor and weapons was influenced by assassination threats. Nobles and wealthy individuals invested in better protection against surprise attacks, leading to innovations in defensive technology. However, this arms race between assassins and their targets was ultimately futile, as determined killers could usually find ways to overcome even the best defenses. The impact on urban development was notable. Cities began to be designed with security in mind, featuring more defensible buildings, better lighting, and improved surveillance capabilities. Wealthy districts became increasingly separated from poor areas, creating physical barriers that reflected social divisions. The architecture of individual buildings also changed in response to assassination threats. Wealthy homes featured more secure entrances, hidden passages for escape, and defensive features that could protect against attack. These modifications were expensive and often made buildings less comfortable and functional, but they were considered necessary for survival. The psychological impact on society as a whole was profound. The knowledge that assassination was possible and relatively common created a general atmosphere of suspicion and fear. People became more guarded in their interactions, less trusting of strangers, and more aware of potential threats in their environment. This generalized fear had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it may have reduced some forms of crime and antisocial behavior as people became more cautious and security conscious. On the negative side, it reduced social cohesion, trust, and cooperation, making society less efficient and less pleasant for everyone. The impact on children was particularly concerning. Growing up in an environment where assassination was a constant threat shaped their understanding of human nature, social relationships, and moral behavior. Many children developed anxiety, paranoia, and other psychological problems as a result of living with constant fear. The educational system had to adapt to teach children about assassination risks without traumatizing them completely. This was a delicate balance that was not always successfully maintained. Some children became overly fearful and withdrawn, while others became fascinated with violence and death in unhealthy ways. The long-term effects on medieval civilization were substantial. The energy and resources devoted to protection against assassination were diverted from other activities that might have promoted social, economic, and cultural development. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion may have slowed innovation, reduced cooperation, and hindered the development of more open and democratic institutions. However, the threat of assassination also spurred some positive developments. The need for better security led to innovations in technology, organization, and communication. The demand for protection services created new economic opportunities and professional specializations. The legal and administrative responses to assassination helped develop more sophisticated systems of justice and governance. The regional variations in assassination impact reflected different social, political, and economic conditions. Some areas developed effective countermeasures that reduced the threat, while others remained vulnerable for extended periods. These differences affected regional development patterns and contributed to the uneven progress of medieval civilization. The class-based nature of assassination fear created additional social tensions. While wealthy and powerful individuals could afford extensive security measures, ordinary people remained vulnerable to various forms of violence and intimidation. This disparity reinforced existing social hierarchies while creating resentment among those who could not afford protection. The gender dimensions of assassination fear were complex. Women faced different types of threats than men, and their options for protection were more limited due to social restrictions on their activities and movements. This may have contributed to the subordinate status of women in medieval society, as their vulnerability to violence was used to justify their exclusion from public life. The religious and moral dimensions of assassination fear created ongoing debates about the proper response to violence and the role of divine protection in human affairs. Different religious traditions offered different explanations for why assassination occurred and what could be done to prevent it. These debates influenced both individual behavior and social policy. The technological responses to assassination threats drove innovation in various fields. Better locks, stronger doors, improved lighting, and more effective weapons were all developed partly in response to security needs. These innovations had applications beyond personal protection and contributed to broader technological progress. The economic analysis of assassination impact reveals the enormous hidden costs of this form of violence. Beyond the direct costs of security measures, there were indirect costs from reduced trade, limited travel, decreased investment, and general economic inefficiency caused by fear and suspicion. These costs were borne by society as a whole, not just by the direct targets of assassination. The international comparison of assassination impact shows that different societies developed different coping mechanisms and achieved different levels of success in controlling the threat. Some regions managed to reduce assassination to manageable levels through effective law enforcement and social organization, while others remained plagued by violence for extended periods. In conclusion, the legacy of fear created by medieval assassination extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire societies. This fear shaped how people lived, worked, and related to one another, creating lasting changes in social organization, economic activity, and cultural development. While some of these changes may have had positive effects, the overall impact was largely negative, diverting resources from productive activities and creating an atmosphere of suspicion and anxiety that reduced the quality of life for everyone. The true cost of medieval assassination was not just measured in individual deaths, but in the broader social damage caused by the fear it generated, a legacy that continued to influence European civilization long after the profession itself had largely disappeared. The medieval assassin, despite being one of history's most feared figures, was ultimately doomed by the very forces that had created the profession in the first place. As European society evolved and modernized, the conditions that had made assassination both necessary and possible gradually disappeared, leaving the profession obsolete and its practitioners extinct. Understanding this decline reveals the final irony of the assassin's existence. They were not just the worst job in history, but also a job that was destined to eliminate itself. The transformation began in the late medieval period as centralized monarchies grew stronger and more effective. Kings and princes who had once relied on feudal levies and local militias began to develop professional armies and bureaucracies that could maintain order more effectively than the chaotic patchwork of local authorities that had characterized earlier periods. This centralization of power made it much more difficult for assassins to operate with impunity. The development of more sophisticated legal systems was crucial to the decline of assassination. As courts became more professional and systematic, they became better at investigating crimes, tracking down perpetrators, and coordinating with other jurisdictions. The informal networks of corruption and protection that had allowed assassins to operate were gradually replaced by more formal and accountable institutions. The improvement in communication systems played a vital role in making assassination more difficult and dangerous. The expansion of trade routes, the development of postal systems, and the growth of urban centers created networks of information that could quickly spread news of crimes and descriptions of suspects. An assassin, who might once have escaped by fleeing to a distant city, now found that word of their crimes had preceded them. The economic changes of the late medieval period also contributed to the decline of assassination. As trade expanded and became more sophisticated, alternative methods of resolving disputes became available. Commercial law developed to handle business conflicts. Banking systems provided ways to manage financial disagreements, and professional arbitrators offered alternatives to violence. The crude tool of assassination became less necessary as more refined instruments of power became available. The rise of professional military forces had a particularly significant impact on the assassination profession. As rulers developed standing armies with professional soldiers, the market for freelance violence declined. Military men who might once have become assassins when their services were no longer needed could now find employment in permanent military organizations. This reduced the pool of potential recruits while also providing more effective security for potential targets. The development of firearms technology, while still primitive in the late medieval period, began to change the nature of violence and security. Early guns were unreliable and slow to reload, but they offered the possibility of killing at a distance without the extensive training required for archery. This democratization of lethal force made it easier for potential targets to defend themselves while also making the assassin's traditional weapons less effective. The growth of urban centers created both opportunities and challenges for assassins. On one hand, cities provided anonymity and hiding places that could facilitate criminal activity. On the other hand, they also provided better law enforcement, more witnesses, and more sophisticated security measures. The balance gradually shifted against the assassins as urban authorities became more effective at maintaining order. The religious changes of the late medieval period also affected the assassination profession. The Church's growing emphasis on confession, penance, and redemption created pressure on criminals to reform their ways. While this didn't eliminate assassination entirely, it did create moral and psychological barriers that made the profession less attractive to potential recruits. The development of diplomatic immunity and formal international law began to provide protection for some potential targets. Ambassadors, merchants, and other international figures gained legal protections that made attacking them more dangerous and less profitable. This reduced the market for assassination services while increasing the risks for practitioners. The improvement in medical knowledge and practice made assassination attempts less likely to succeed. Better understanding of poisons and their antidotes, improved surgical techniques, and more effective treatments for wounds meant that targets were more likely to survive attacks. This reduced the effectiveness of assassins while increasing their exposure to capture and punishment. The social changes of the late medieval period also worked against the assassination profession. The growth of literacy, the development of printing, and the expansion of education created a more informed and sophisticated population that was less tolerant of violence and more supportive of legal solutions to disputes. Public opinion began to turn against assassination as a legitimate tool of statecraft. The economic prosperity of the late medieval period provided more opportunities for legitimate employment, reducing the desperation that had driven many people into the assassination profession. As trade expanded and new industries developed, people had alternatives to crime that had not existed in earlier periods. This reduced the supply of potential assassins while also creating more resources for security and law enforcement. The development of insurance and other financial instruments provided new ways to manage risk and protect against loss. Merchants and nobles could now protect their investments and provide for their families without resorting to violence. This reduced the demand for assassination services, while also providing resources for better security measures. The improvement in transportation and communication made it easier for authorities to coordinate their efforts against criminals. Information about wanted assassins could be shared quickly between different jurisdictions, making it much more difficult for criminals to escape by fleeing to distant locations. The world was becoming smaller and more connected, leaving fewer places for assassins to hide. The professionalization of various occupations provided legitimate career paths for people with the skills that might have made them effective assassins. Military service, law enforcement, private security, and even entertainment offered ways for people with violent skills to earn a living without resorting to crime. This channeled potential assassins into legitimate activities while also improving overall security. The legal reforms of the late medieval period made the justice system more effective and more fair. Better procedures for investigating crimes, more consistent application of laws, and more proportionate punishments made the legal system a more attractive alternative to private violence. People were more willing to seek justice through the courts when they believed the system would treat them fairly. The cultural changes of the period also worked against assassination. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and rational thought created a climate that was less tolerant of crude violence and more appreciative of sophisticated solutions to problems. Assassination began to be seen as barbaric and primitive, unsuitable for civilized society. The technological improvements in security made assassination more difficult and dangerous. Better locks, stronger doors, improved lighting, and more effective weapons gave potential targets better protection while making the assassin's job more challenging. The arms race between assassins and their targets was gradually being won by the defenders. The international nature of late medieval society made assassination more complicated and risky. Criminals could no longer assume that they could escape justice by fleeing to another jurisdiction. International cooperation in law enforcement was improving, and the consequences of assassination were becoming more severe and more certain. The decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized states eliminated many of the political conditions that had made assassination attractive. The complex web of competing loyalties, disputed successions, and local conflicts that had characterized feudal society was gradually replaced by more stable and predictable political arrangements. This reduced the demand for assassination services while also making the practice more dangerous for those who attempted it. The development of professional diplomacy provided new ways to resolve international disputes without resorting to violence. Trained ambassadors, formal treaties, and established protocols for negotiation offered alternatives to the crude expedient of murdering one's enemies. This civilizing process made assassination seem increasingly barbaric and counterproductive. The growth of merchant classes and commercial interests created powerful constituencies that favored stability and predictability over the chaos that assassination brought. Businessmen needed secure trade routes, reliable contracts, and stable governments to prosper. They used their growing economic influence to support legal and political systems that discouraged violence and promoted peaceful resolution of disputes. The improvement in record-keeping and documentation made it much more difficult for assassins to maintain false identities or escape their past crimes. Better administrative systems meant that suspicious individuals were more likely to be detected and investigated. The informal, oral culture that had allowed assassins to reinvent themselves was being replaced by a more systematic and documented society. The development of professional law enforcement was perhaps the most important factor in the decline of assassination. As cities and kingdoms developed dedicated police forces, investigative techniques, and systematic approaches to crime prevention, the amateur criminals who made up most of the assassination profession found themselves outmatched. Professional law enforcement officers had training, resources, and institutional support that individual assassins could not compete with. The rise of banking and credit systems provided new ways to exert economic pressure without resorting to violence. A merchant who might once have hired an assassin to eliminate a business rival could now use financial instruments to achieve the same goal more safely and effectively. Economic warfare began to replace physical violence as the preferred method of commercial competition. The improvement in public health and sanitation made poison-based assassination more difficult and less effective. Better understanding of disease and contamination meant that suspicious deaths were more likely to be investigated and their true causes discovered. The crude poisons that had been the assassin's stock in trade became less reliable as medical knowledge improved. The development of printing and mass communication made it much more difficult for assassins to operate in secrecy. News of crimes spread more quickly and widely, making it harder for criminals to escape detection. The growth of literacy also meant that more people could read wanted posters, legal notices, and other information that might help identify criminals. The social mobility that characterized the late medieval period provided legitimate paths to advancement that had not existed earlier. People who might once have turned to crime out of desperation now had opportunities to improve their circumstances through trade, crafts, military service, or other legitimate activities. This reduced the pool of potential recruits for the assassination profession. The religious reforms and moral movements of the period created stronger social pressure against violence and crime. The emphasis on personal responsibility, moral behavior, and social order made assassination less acceptable to both potential practitioners and the general public. The profession lost whatever social legitimacy it might once have possessed. The development of more sophisticated financial systems made it easier to trace money and identify the sources of funding for criminal activities. Assassins and their employers could no longer assume that financial transactions would remain secret. This made it more dangerous to hire assassins and more difficult for them to collect payment for their services. The improvement in transportation systems had paradoxical effects on the assassination profession. While better roads and vehicles made it easier for assassins to travel, they also made it easier for law enforcement to pursue them. The same systems that facilitated criminal mobility also enhanced the ability of authorities to coordinate their response to crime. The growth of international trade created networks of merchants, bankers, and officials who had strong interests in maintaining peace and stability. These networks became powerful forces for law and order, using their influence to support effective law enforcement and oppose the chaos that assassination brought. The international business community became a constituency for civilization and against barbarism. The development of more sophisticated intelligence systems gave governments better tools for detecting and preventing assassination attempts. Spy networks, informants, and surveillance systems made it much more difficult for assassins to plan and execute their crimes without detection. The amateur criminals who made up most of the profession were no match for professional intelligence operations. The legal codification that characterized the late medieval period created more consistent and predictable justice systems. When people could expect fair treatment from the courts, they were less likely to resort to private violence. The rule of law gradually replaced the rule of force as the primary mechanism for resolving disputes. The cultural renaissance that began in the late medieval period emphasized reason, education, and civilized behavior over crude violence. Assassination came to be seen as a relic of a more barbaric age, unsuitable for enlightened society. This cultural shift made the profession less attractive to potential practitioners and less tolerable to the general public. The economic specialization that accompanied the growth of trade and industry created more opportunities for people to develop legitimate skills and careers. The generalists who had once turned to assassination when other opportunities failed could now specialize in particular trades or professions that provided steady employment and social respectability. The improvement in urban planning and architecture made cities safer and more secure. Better lighting, wider streets, and more defensible buildings reduced the opportunities for criminal activity while making it easier for authorities to maintain order. The physical environment became less conducive to the kind of secretive violence that assassination required. The development of professional military academies and training programs provided legitimate outlets for people with violent skills and inclinations. Young men who might once have become assassins could now pursue careers as professional soldiers, receiving training, steady pay, and social recognition for their service. This channeled potential criminals into legitimate activities while also improving overall security. The growth of literacy and education created a more informed and sophisticated population that was less tolerant of violence and more supportive of legal solutions to problems. Educated people were more likely to understand the benefits of stable institutions and less likely to support the chaos that assassination brought. The development of more effective medical treatments reduced the lethality of assassination attempts. Victims who might once have died from their wounds could now be saved by better surgical techniques and medical care. This reduced the effectiveness of assassins while increasing their exposure to capture and punishment. The improvement in communication systems made it much easier for potential targets to call for help and for authorities to respond quickly to threats. The isolation that had once made assassination possible was being eliminated by better roads, faster messengers, and more reliable communication networks. The rise of professional guilds and trade associations provided new forms of social organization that could protect their members and resolve disputes peacefully. These organizations offered alternatives to violence while also creating constituencies for law and order. The growth of civil society gradually displaced the crude violence that had characterized earlier periods. The development of more sophisticated financial instruments provided new ways to manage risk and protect against loss. Insurance, banking, and credit systems offered alternatives to violence for people seeking to protect their interests or resolve disputes. The crude tool of assassination became unnecessary as more refined instruments became available. By the end of the medieval period, the combination of all these factors had made assassination an increasingly obsolete profession. The social, economic, political, and technological changes that characterized the transition to the modern world had eliminated most of the conditions that had made assassination both necessary and possible. The few assassins who remained were increasingly isolated, ineffective, and vulnerable to the improving law enforcement systems of the emerging modern states. The final irony of the medieval assassin was that their very existence had helped to create the conditions that would eventually eliminate them. The fear and chaos they generated had motivated the development of better security, more effective law enforcement, and more stable political institutions. In trying to profit from the weaknesses of medieval society, they had inadvertently contributed to the strengthening of that society and their own eventual obsolescence. The last medieval assassins were pathetic figures, relics of a bygone age, clinging to an obsolete profession in a world that had moved beyond them. They were no longer the feared figures they had once been, but rather criminals, whose crude methods were easily detected and defeated by the more sophisticated systems of the emerging modern world. Their disappearance marked not just the end of a profession, but the triumph of civilization over barbarism, of law over chaos, of reason over violence. As we reach the end of our exhaustive journey through the nightmare world of medieval assassination, the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Being a medieval assassin was not just a bad job. It was quite possibly the worst profession in human history. Every aspect of the assassin's existence, from recruitment to retirement, was characterized by suffering, degradation, and ultimate futility. We've seen how the romantic myths surrounding assassins crumble under historical scrutiny. There were no elite brotherhoods, no honorable codes, no paths to wealth and glory. Instead, there were desperate people making desperate choices, trading their humanity for the slim chance of survival in a world that offered them nothing else. The reality was grinding poverty, constant fear, social isolation, and moral corruption that destroyed everything that made life worth living. The economics of assassination were deliberately exploitative, designed to keep practitioners desperate and dependent while enriching those who controlled them. The tools were crude and unreliable, as likely to kill the user as the target. The methods were messy and traumatic, requiring assassins to sacrifice their psychological well-being for temporary financial gain. The social isolation was complete and permanent, cutting assassins off from all normal human relationships and condemning them to lives of loneliness and paranoia. The constant fear was unbearable, creating a state of chronic anxiety that destroyed both mental and physical health. The physical toll was enormous, aging assassins rapidly and leaving them broken shells of their former selves. The moral corruption was perhaps the most tragic aspect of all, transforming ordinary people into monsters who had lost all capacity for love, trust, and genuine human connection. The hierarchy of the profession was designed to exploit those at the bottom while protecting those at the top, creating a system that consumed its own practitioners. The methods of murder were crude and unreliable, often failing at crucial moments and leaving assassins exposed to capture and punishment. The investigations that followed successful assassinations were surprisingly effective, using networks of informants and systematic techniques to track down perpetrators. The punishments were deliberately horrific, designed not just to end lives but to serve as spectacular deterrents to others. The legacy of fear created by assassination extended far beyond individual victims to encompass entire societies, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and anxiety that reduced the quality of life for everyone. Yet ultimately, this very fear contributed to the development of better security, more effective law enforcement, and more stable institutions that would eventually make the profession obsolete. The decline and disappearance of medieval assassination was inevitable, driven by the same social, economic, and political forces that had originally created the profession. As society became more civilized, more organized, and more prosperous, the conditions that had made assassination both necessary and possible gradually disappeared. But perhaps the most damning indictment of the assassin's profession is not what it did to its practitioners, but what it failed to accomplish. Despite all the suffering, all the violence, all the fear and chaos they created, medieval assassins ultimately changed nothing. The powerful remained powerful, the corrupt remained corrupt, and the unjust systems they claimed to fight against continued to function. Their victims were replaced, their employers found new tools, and the world moved on as if they had never existed. The medieval assassin represents one of humanity's greatest failures, the creation of a profession so destructive that it consumed everyone who entered it while accomplishing nothing of lasting value. It was a job that offered no real rewards, no genuine satisfaction, no hope for a better future. It was a dead end in the most literal sense, a path that led nowhere but to the grave. Yet people continued to enter this profession because they saw no alternative. They were driven by desperation, by circumstances beyond their control, by a world that offered them no better choices. In many ways, the assassins were as much victims as the people they killed, victims of poverty, injustice, and a social system that created monsters out of ordinary people. The lesson of the medieval assassin is not just about the dangers of a particular profession, but about the importance of creating societies that offer people genuine alternatives to desperation. When people have no hope, no opportunities, no way to improve their circumstances through legitimate means, some will inevitably turn to illegitimate ones. The assassins were symptoms of a deeper disease, a world that failed to provide for its people and then punished them for the choices that failure forced upon them. Today, as we face our own challenges with violence, crime, and social inequality, the story of the medieval assassin reminds us that there are no easy solutions, no simple answers. But it also reminds us that the cost of failure is measured not just in individual lives, but in the corruption of the human spirit itself. The medieval assassin was indeed the worst job in history, not just because it was dangerous or poorly paid, but because it required people to sacrifice everything that made them human. It was a profession that destroyed everyone it touched, leaving behind only shadows and regrets. In the end, the greatest tragedy was not that so many assassins died young, but that so few of them ever truly lived at all. So the next time you see a movie or play a game that glorifies the life of an assassin, remember the reality behind the myth. Remember the desperate people who chose this path not out of ambition or adventure, but out of sheer desperation. Remember the price they paid, not just in blood, but in everything that makes life worth living. And perhaps, in remembering their tragedy, we can work to build a world where no one ever again faces such terrible choices, where desperation doesn't drive people to become monsters, where everyone has the chance to live with dignity, purpose, and hope. That would be the greatest tribute we could pay to those forgotten souls who sacrificed everything for nothing, who lived in darkness so complete that even their deaths brought no light. The medieval assassin's story is over, but the lessons it teaches us are eternal. May we have the wisdom to learn from their tragedy, and the courage to ensure that such desperate choices never again become necessary for human survival. In the flickering candlelight of history, the medieval assassin stands as a warning, a reminder of what we can become when society fails its most vulnerable members, when desperation becomes the only teacher, and when the choice is between becoming a monster or becoming nothing at all. They chose monstrosity, and in doing so, they lost everything that made them human. Their story ends not with glory or redemption, but with silence. The silence of lives wasted, potential destroyed, and humanity sacrificed on the altar of survival. It is a silence that should haunt us, challenge us, and ultimately inspire us to build a world where such choices are never necessary again. The worst job in history has finally ended, but its lessons remain. May we learn from them, and may we never forget the price of desperation, the cost of abandoning our most vulnerable, and the terrible consequences when society fails to offer hope to those who need it most.